Hi, my name is Tanya White, and this week I want to speak about Parshat Behaalotacha. The idea that I want to share with you is how we deal with crisis and what we can learn from the way in which crisis is dealt with in this week's Parsha. Let's just for a minute frame what's happening. People of Israel ready to enter the land. The men have been counted for battle. The tribes are encamped around the Mishkan, the tabernacle. The princes have bought their gifts. Moshe has invited Yitro to join them on the journey. He refuses. He goes back to his people. The ark is lifted and the people are starting to move. V'yihi bin Saaron, the ark moves in front of them. And at that climatic moment of transition to a new reality, a new destination, the flow is interrupted by a verse that is put in two upside down nuns. The verse V'yihi bin Saaron, which has become part of our liturgy when we put the Torah back in the ark, is framed by two upside down nuns. And the question is why? What happens immediately after is that people complain, they demand to return to Egypt, they describe all the imagined delicacies that they enjoy there, and they complain that they want meat. Rabbi Menachem Leibtag suggests that the upside down, the inverted verse expresses an ideal reality that in the end never occurs. The people were meant to enter the land miraculously with the ark in front of them, defeating the enemies as they journeyed, whereas in reality, the second generation goes in, but they have to fight their own battles. If we employ this reading, the Torah is using a literary tool here to convey a profound dissonance between the ideal and the real. In that gap, the gap between the ideal and the real, it is a gap that engenders disappointment, despair, despondency, anger, resentment, but it's also a place of potential for growth, for transformation. In fact, it's in that gap where actually life is lived and the journey to the promised land can begin. The text depicts a situation of extreme disappointment on the part of God and Moshe with the people. We see that Moshe, for the first time ever, has a crisis of leadership, and he even so far as goes to ask for God to kill him. In addition, we see the despair and the anger and the resentment on the part of the people. Perhaps their anger is at Moshe and God, maybe even subconsciously at themselves, a self-resentment born of an inadequacy and that they feel about their own abilities. What I want to argue is that the text has an inextricable weaving between these two narratives, between Moshe's response and the people's response. And the reason why is because I believe that they both face a crisis, but they offer divergent models on how to respond to the crisis. Moshe, aided by God, uses the crisis towards constructive and transformative ends. The people, plagued by their slave mentality, are ill-equipped to do that. And in the end, it's the beginning of their downfall. What we see is that the people want to become independent. Part of this crisis is that they are in this liminal space, this kind of teenage hood between childlike and infant type dependent existence to an adult mature existence in which they take control and agency of their life. This is the stage of the Midbar. This is this liminal space. Donald Winnicott, who is a renowned British child psychoanalyst and pediatrician, he discusses the stages of child development. And in his opinion, it's the stage of the breast that forms a critical foundation for childhood security. In perceiving the breast to be part of the child himself, an illusion of omnipotence is achieved. The task of the mother is to gently and securely wean the infant so that he or she gradually achieves an independent sense of self and takes agency of their own reality. He calls it disillusioning the infant. In Hebrew, the word for breast is shad, which is very similar to one of the names by which we describe God, Kel Shaddai. This name of God is describing exactly what God is in that moment, a source of sustenance and the provider of the world. But as much as it's enticing for a parent to continue this stage of the breast, of the parenting, of the dependency, continually protecting their child and keeping them safe at home, providing for their needs, such an experience ultimately, if it continues, will leave the child inadequate and immature to deal with the world. In the words of Jordan Peterson, do we want to make our child safe or competent? That's always the question when we parent, especially when we are parenting teenagers. The journey to positive freedom requires us to make space for our children. The journey to positive freedom of the nation requires God to make space for the people to take active responsibility of their future. It requires God to take a back seat and allow them to slowly transition into their own leadership role. In some ways, God needs to disillusion, to wean the people so that they do not become too dependent on his omnipotent saving hand. With this in mind, perhaps we can understand what happens next, and we can understand the complaints that they bring to Moshe and the people. They complain about the man. They complain that in Egypt they remembered the fish and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks. They're sick of it. They don't want the man. They want to rid themselves of it. They crave meat. And so what do? They take the man and they grind it and they cook it and they make it into cakes. And the text tells us it tastes like shad hashemen. It's not by chance the word shad is used here. The milk of the breast, the rebellion of the people against their dependent nature of the man reveals an implicit immaturity demonstrated by what they do desire. They crave meat, and this underscores their juvenile persona, their need for immediate gratification. The boredom of the man is replaced not with positive freedom, but with another form of infanthood, of hedonism. The man ritual represents a lifestyle of dependency, much like, by the way, state benefits or much older child in his parents' home, or any example you want to bring. The man was sustenance that required very little, if no input on the part of the beneficiary. It required faith, yes, but no active agency. Quite akin to a teenager who rebels against the suffocating presence of the authoritative parents. The people are rebelling against God's immediate presence, God's being dependent on God. And so they grind it and they bake it and they try to make it into something. They try to process an instantaneous thing. But their desire for meat also is a desire for active participation, but it's without the responsibility. It represents this lifestyle that, unfortunately, today in a postmodern world, in many cultures that we see, people who want rights without responsibility, freedom without loyalty, self-expression without the concern for community. These people are not ripe for full independence, even though they think they are. They say we're free, but they're not really. It's almost like a child who wants to run before they can walk, or a teenager who wants to live a life of continual partying without any responsibility. The people of Israel, they believe they're ready to exit the cradle of Moshe and God's nursing arms, but they're neither cognitively, spiritually, physiologically developed enough to do so. In a parallel narrative, inextricably interweaved, as I said, with this narrative, is Moshe's response. Moshe also has a visceral outpouring of despair and despondence. And he uses the same imagery that the people use, right? Did I give birth to these people? Did I conceive them? Should I carry them in my bosom like a nursemaid carries a baby? Very, very similar imagery. And we see that his despair stems from his position as the nursing father, who in some ways understands the people better than they understand themselves. He feels he's failed. He feels he's disillusioned with them because he understands where they are coming from. He understands that they want independence before they are ready for total independence. And it's this gap between the ideal and the real that Moshe uses in some ways to reframe his reality, to reframe who he is. God invites 70 elders to have Moshe's spirit put upon them. All of a sudden, Moshe sees, by having his spirit put on the others, the impact that he has had on others. Rabbi Sachs speaks about the fact that the Spirit these people don't prophesy again, because at that moment, that's all Moshe needed. He needed to see his Spirit upon the others in order to know the impact that he was having. In the end, the people don't enter the land they originally planned, right? In the end, Moshe goes back to the people. Two crises, two responses that seem similar: despair, despondency, and two outcomes that are different. Why? Because in one, the crisis is used not as a way to pivot towards constructive reframing, but rather as a way of simply going further and further down in a downward spiral. That is the people. Moshe uses the crisis and, with the help of God, pivots it towards constructive, future-oriented means. What we see is, unfortunately, the first generation don't go in, and the second generation, in the end, are the ones that have to go in, because they are able to understand what it is to be functioning, independent people in their land. Two crises, two similar response, two divergent outcomes. Every crisis we face in our lives is allied to a certain sense of disillusionment. Winnicott describes it coming as the origins of this disillusion of the infant and the breast, but throughout our lives, there's always moments of inverted nuns. There's always that watershed verse, that reality of the what could have been. And in every situation, we have a choice. Do we choose meat or spirit? The people chose meat. Moshe chooses spirit. Do we rally to return to a distorted and idealized version of the past that's been lost, that we can't go back to? Or do we look to the future and choose a journey to the promised land, even with the fears, responsibilities, and burdens that it entails, even if it's not exactly the version we first envisioned? Do we choose despair or hope? Can we strive for the ideal while living in the real? Can we be free and responsible? These are the questions that I believe sit at the very heart of the book of Bamidbar, and nowhere more than as we've seen in this week's Parsha. And they are questions that are of such urgency today, as the answers to these questions will certainly determine the kind of world we live in tomorrow. That I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and we should only know peaceful and good times.